One does not simply build an empire. There are plenty of things that can go wrong when you're choosing which buildings to construct in a province, and there is generally a certain order to do things. However, do remember that all campaigns and legendary lords and different factions can be very different, so while some details here will be applicable to most factions, there may be some that it doesn't really apply to, or they'll work differently. So here in this Empire Karl Franz campaign, I've taken my entire first province, but I haven't done anything with it yet. I haven't built any buildings. These are just the settlements as they are when I took them, so that I can mess around and show you things. So what's the first thing you need to worry about when building up the economy of a province? Well, that would be growth, courtesy of the farm buildings for the Empire. These are the key to supporting every other function of your economy. The growth tooltip shows us that it's all about population surplus points. These are gained through this number on the left. Once it reaches the threshold of 375, 115 per turn, it's going to take 4 turns. Once I get that 375, I'll get myself a population point. And these are the most crucial thing that we need to be able to upgrade our settlements and get everything better. This number simply shows you how many turns are left to get the point. So with these population surplus points, as I say, this is what we're going to use to upgrade the actual settlement itself. You can see this little bluey number here. It says 2, which means we need 2 population surplus points. Currently I only have 1. I've got to wait 4 turns and then I'll get a second one and I'll be able to upgrade this to tier 3. Alternatively, with that 1 population surplus point we already have, we could upgrade one of our minor settlements. These only take 1 population surplus point, as indicated by the white number there, so we could upgrade this or this right now. And as you'll see, if we do that, we use up our population surplus point, which now means we have 0. So we're going to have to wait longer to get another 1 or 2 back, which means getting this to tier 3 is going to take longer. So do think about that when you're upgrading settlements. Don't always just rush to use your population surplus points. You might want to save them up so you can get your main building, your main settlement, your capital to tier 3, 4, higher, whatever. So overall, when you're trying to build up a province, you want as much growth as possible. This can come in many different forms. Here at this grazing pastures, I've got a good bit of growth from that. Always, typically as well, your first technology that you'll want to research will be the one that gives you growth, because it'll make you the most growth overall if you take it as early as possible. So good to make that your first choice for building up your first province especially. So the main building type you want first of all is going to be growth buildings, and you can even put them in a tier 5 settlement even though they're only tier 3. Normally we wouldn't want to do this because it's a waste of a tier 5 slot, but it's going to help us for now and we can delete it later when we need something else to go in that slot. When you capture a province as well, you'll get your commandments. That's another way to get some extra growth potentially, which is just going to help us build this economy much quicker. So take every little bit of growth you can as early as possible. Moving on a little further down the line here, and you can see I've got growth buildings goddamn everywhere. So we've got growth coming out the wazoo. So this means quicker population surplus points, which means ultimately more growth of my economy because I can upgrade the tiers of buildings to 2 and 3, get all the highest amounts of everything faster. Now let's talk about income. We could go down a very different route with building this province by building all the income buildings in the land instead of any growth buildings. How would this affect our economy, and would this be a good idea? Well, business would of course be booming. My income 3,000 per turn, very nice for this early campaign, but my growth is suffering, which obviously means slower population points, which means slower growth overall for my province, as I won't be able to upgrade the settlement itself or its buildings as quickly. So slower growth ultimately means less public order, less anti-corruption or corruption if you're one of the bad guy factions, slower recruitment, potentially slower replenishment, as well as a few other things. But ultimately, if you can't upgrade the settlement to a higher tier, you can't upgrade the public order building to a higher tier. Thus, less public order than you could get with faster growth. And a similar thing with all the other points, right? So we always need a good bit of growth, but further on in this campaign, you might want something like this. A bit of growth, so we got 2 growth buildings going here, but we do need some income, so we do have 1 income producing building, although money is relatively plentiful in the Empire Reichland campaign. And then in the capital settlement of Altdorf, I've replaced that growth building with paved roads, which still gives me a tiny bit of growth, but also some income as well, so it does a little bit of both. And that's what you need to find when building up a province, is the right balance. You're definitely going to want some growth, maybe a little bit of income, maybe more income. Some factions will need income more than others. High elves with their expensive units, for example. And of course, a province can have anywhere from 1 to 4 settlements in it, so you've got that to think about. If you've only got 2 settlements, you're not going to have so many building slots, so you've got to try and make a good call, whatever the province needs. I'd maybe suggest as a rough guideline to maybe get your settlements all to tier 3 before you worry about tier 4 and 5 of the capital. As I say, that's a rough guideline though. Other factions, in certain situations, you may want a different approach. Now let's talk about the military buildings. These are generally the last you'll need to worry about. It can be tempting though when you see the cool units that you want to get. You might think, oh, I really want to get those demigryphs, or oh, I need some great swords. But do remember that higher tier units are more expensive, and there's no point having the building to be able to recruit them if you can't afford them. And remember, growth is the foundation of everything. If you've got a military, well, that's afforded by income. You want a bigger military, you need more income. How do you increase income? You need more growth by upgrading the tiers of settlements and buildings. So it all comes back to growth being the foundation, the most important layer that facilitates everything else. The income, the military, and like I said, if you don't have the growth and the income in place, you're not going to be able to afford the big, expensive military. In terms of which military building to build when, well, that's entirely up to you based on whichever units you want. A couple of points though here about some situations you might find yourself in. If you've got two of the same military building in a province, you obviously don't need that, as the little exclamation mark tells you. So which one should we delete? Well, that depends on the tier of building. This military building goes up to tier 3, which is the maximum of this settlement. It doesn't go to tier 4 or 5, neither does the military building, so that's fine. It works out nicely in this settlement. But in Altdorf, where things do go up to tier 5, well, this tier 3 building is a bit of a waste because we're likely going to want this slot for one of our tier 4 or 5 buildings later, so we'll demolish that one. Overall, just be aware of the tiers of buildings and where you're putting them. If it's a settlement that goes up to tier 4 or 5, try to reserve those slots for tier 4 or 5 buildings. As I say though, in temporary situations, it can be fine to put tier 3 buildings in a tier 5 settlement and just demolishing them later. Another thing with military buildings to think about is whether you need the same military building in two adjacent provinces. Here I've just taken Marienburg, and obviously I want to keep the Marienburg port, but I do have this military building that does go up to tier 4, so it does have a place in the capital. However, I have this same building over in the Reichland province, so to me it's a bit pointless to have both of those buildings when I could easily just nip over the border to get the horsey units if I want, or use global recruitment, so not much point having that building there. Another important thing after growth and income is control, or public order as I still like to call it from the old Total Wars. This is another essential factor to manage to avoid rebellion and some serious trouble in your provinces. It's quite simple to manage, you just need to try and offset the red numbers with as many green numbers as possible from various sources. The simplest and earliest best way to do this is with, of course, public order buildings. Typically in a province you'll probably only need 1 or 2 public order buildings depending on how bad that province is in terms of control, but it's really such a variable thing between provinces and different campaigns and factions and legendary lords. But as I say, typically 1 or 2 public order buildings in a province should be able to mostly offset the bad things. You can also use commandments and technologies and lords and heroes and armies. A rough rule I tend to set for myself is I build as many public order buildings as needed to offset the difficulty level penalty, which on very hard is only -4. On legendary it's up to -8. On hard I think it's -2. And on normal it's 0. So on the easier difficulties there really isn't too much to worry about. But I think Total War Warhammer 3 public order is pretty easy to maintain in the green. It's not too hard. As I say, just 1 or 2 public order buildings in a province should do the job. Upgrade them when you can. And that brings us to the next point that ties in nicely with control: corruption. If you're a good guy, you'll want to get rid of it. If you're a bad guy, you'll want to spread whatever your kind of corruption is. It works pretty much the same though either way. The biggest detriment of allowing corruption to ruin your lands is that it will ruin your public order or control, and the attrition of armies isn't particularly nice to deal with either. So when corruption seems like it's becoming a problem, you need to find your corruption reducing building. In the case of the Empire, that's the temple here. That gives us up to -12 corruption. You can also use other sources like commandments, lords, heroes, whatever. There's plenty of corruption reduction out there. And again, it's a wildly variable thing for different factions. Kostalton here, for example, has Skaven on his doorstep. That's going to bring Skaven corruption potentially. Azazel to the north, that's going to bring Slaanesh corruption potentially. So he needs to worry more about anti-corruption than maybe Karl Franz does in Reichland. So the urgency of anti-corruption buildings will be different for different factions. And like I mentioned, if you're a bad guy faction, you'll be looking for the building that actually spreads your corruption, because that will likely help you in many different ways. Typically, if you're a bad guy faction, you'll probably want it to be trying to spread corruption as early as possible, whereas if you're a good guy and you don't have to worry about giving off corruption, you may only want to deal with corruption when it starts to become a problem for you. Now a word on unique buildings. those that are typically only built in one specific settlement. The building browser is a great way to see all the different buildings. You can use this for all of the stuff I've been talking about, but in the case of things like ports or resource trade buildings or landmark buildings, these are unique buildings that are only in one specific settlement. And they bring a host of different benefits, of which it's up to you to decide when it's important to build that. Things like trade buildings, which provide resources to trade with other factions, will be essentially income buildings, as will ports. And then you have things more unique like the Red Moon Inn here, bringing the Überschreik 5. That gives anti-corruption, public order, and some money. It does all sorts of stuff. So you just have to look at them and decide whether that building is of any urgent need or whether it can wait till a later slot. And the same can kind of be true of support buildings, military support buildings. These aren't necessary in a lot of cases unless you want to build certain units or gain the benefits of whatever it brings, but overall, they're going to be kind of secondary to the most important things of growth, income, and public order. So as common sense would dictate, build what you need. If you need more income, build the income buildings. If you need more anti-corruption or public order, build any unique buildings that might support that. Now to just a word on the defense buildings that are kind of unique buildings, but not really unique. You can put them in most settlements. But these garrison buildings that increase the size of your garrison are pretty important, I think, especially in times of war. But when and where should you build them? Well, to me, it all depends which part of your province is susceptible to being attacked. In the case of Reichland, in my opinion, it's Eilhart. It's the northernmost settlement and the most likely to be attacked because in this campaign, we've got a lot of potential friends around us. All the Empire factions we can potentially ally with or confederate later. So down to the south of Reichland, I don't really need to worry about being attacked by these factions for the most part. Of course, the Elector Count system might make that happen, but mostly we don't really need to worry about being attacked from the south. There are the vampires over in the east a little bit, but they'll rarely push this far over unless they start conquering all of these other Empire factions along the way. So I'm kind of safe from my southern border, right? I don't really need to worry about these angles of being attacked. So Grunsburg, down the bottom, Überschreik, they don't really need any kind of defensive building. Because most of my potential wars will come from the Greenskins up here, Festus is over here, the Norskins may come down, Marienburg could declare war on me and come after me, so there's all the potential enemies of the Reichland campaign to the north, for the most part. Thus, it makes more sense for the defensive buildings to go in Eilhart and, well, Altdorf. Not that you can have one in Altdorf, but I need to put better protection on Altdorf because it is more vulnerable, being in the north of my territory. So Überschreik and Grunsburg don't really need defensive buildings. They should be fine. There is, of course, the potential they could get attacked. They're not invincible or completely safe by any means. But if I put a defensive building there, it kind of takes away a slot that could be used for an income building or an extra growth building that's going to be more beneficial to growing the province. And one last unique type building to look out for is the gold mine. These are incredibly valuable for obvious reasons. If you're thinking about expanding your territory, you may want to see who's got the local nearby gold mines and go after those, because they're worth a lot of wonga. And that is pretty much the gist of it for building up provinces, in my opinion. And what does a finished province look like? Well, this. This is pretty much finished Reichland, a few buildings to still upgrade, but it's all done. We replaced our growth buildings with income buildings as we don't need the growth buildings anymore. They're literally pointless once everything's been upgraded, apart from a little replenishment maybe, but that's not a huge deal. We'll get that from other sources. We've got the old Red Moon Inn bringing the Überschreik 5, the Vermintide 2 in-joke there. We've got the trade buildings for the extra income. I've got the Imperial Palace to give a big faction-wide buff to public order as well as everything else it does for the settlement. And you'll notice in Altdorf, everything is tier 4 or 5 buildings pretty much, not all of them upgraded yet, but everything is a tier 4 or 5 building, apart from the trade building, but that can only go there anyway. And then all the stuff that is tier 3 goes in the minor settlements. And then in Eilhart, I've got that defensive building, as it is the most likely to be attacked. I would put one in Altdorf if I could, but I can't, so what are you going to do? I've got the armored watches, that decreases corruption, gives a bit of control, checks for Skaven and all that stuff. And of course, I've got my military buildings scattered in inappropriately, tier 3, 4, 5 buildings, wherever. I've got the armory that allows me to unlock great swords and demigriffs that also require that. So I've got everything I need to get all of the units I want, whilst making the province profitable and keeping it safe in terms of public order and defenses. Overall, constructing your buildings is all about managing these things, and you can do that with the buildings. That's kind of your base layer of managing it. But if something is particularly in need of some extra help, like you need more growth, you need more income, you've got to try and manage your public order better, there's plenty of other sources to help manage it. For example, Lords and Heroes with their skill points, Iron Disciplinarian, that'll give you control. You can get anti-corruption in skill points. You can stimulate growth in skill points potentially. Of course, different for different factions, different Lords and Heroes can do different things. It's the same with technology. You're just increasing and helping and managing all the same things that your buildings will manage, taking whichever one is most needed at the time. And the same with unique faction mechanics like the Kislev Motherland mechanic. This can increase your growth by 20, it can increase your income. All these different ways can support the same things that your buildings do to help you manage and grow your province. And that just about does it. In summary, focus on growth early to get all the buildings leveled up so that you can increase your income, because that is needed to increase your military, and your military obviously conquers the lands and does the winning of the campaign for you. And support your buildings from other sources when necessary. If corruption's becoming pretty bad, change your commandment to one that reduces corruption. Add some lord or hero skill points that reduce corruption. Or maybe focus a tech that supports that cause too. You get the idea. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the future.